Soul and survival differs from appearance and circumstance in a number of ways. First of all, I think that appearance and circumstance was essentially a how-to book that incorporated a lot of some case taking as well as remedy selection, and it always matched everything that we were doing back to the remedy. Soul and Survival, however, is a different book entirely, because what Soul and Survival is about is the introduction of some brand new concepts into the way that I and a number of HFA practitioners now practice. And these differences are quite marked from the way that I was taught homeopathy, and indeed even in the way that I used to teach homeopathy. These differences create an absolutely different paradigm to the treatment and understanding of chronic disease that is entirely separate from the classical model. One of the ways that that occurs is particularly in our understanding of what I believe a miasm is. In the contemporary model, of course, a miasm is something that is inherited. And that is an inherited disease where this disease, in particular syphilis or sora or psychosis, is then engrafted onto the economy and is then passed on to the next generation. Theoretically, this passing on of the miasm weakens each generation, and each generation is born to a level of activity where that miasm was at the time of conception. So I not only believed that for a long time, but I also taught that. But what becomes quite apparent in Soul and Survival is that concept is no longer present. And I see miasms from an entirely different view. I see miasms from the point of, rather than it being a disease, that it's in fact nature trying to help us out. When Hahnemann saw the action of sora and thought that sora as a disease was on the skin and had an action, that centrifugal action that is mimicked by sulfur and lycopodium and the psoric remedies, that is centrifugal meaning that it pushes from inside out. I still see that action as valid, so I think Hahnemann was spot on, but I see it as a defense system. This is the way that our survival instinct protects itself. It is not sora, the disease, that is pushing to the circumference, but outward motion as a survival instinct that is pushing stress and disease out to the circumference. It's not psychosis, the disease, that is encapsulating poisons and bacteria into cysts and tumours, but circular motion as a defense system that is doing it, from stopping these viruses and bacteria from becoming systemic as best as it possibly can. That slight theoretical change in seeing health and illness from the perspective of a disease model that needs to be removed in very much a medical model, into a new paradigm where what we're looking at is a survival instinct or a defense mechanism that needs to be bolstered, makes for an entirely different way of viewing what chronic disease is. Because chronic disease no longer is an infection. Chronic disease becomes an outcome of the stresses and turmoils and tribulations that our patient has had to endure. And what that means for us when it comes to our clinical practice is that it means that our job as a homeopath, in chronic disease at least, is to supplement the drained life force that has been taken from the patient by a body or a survival instinct that is trying to balance itself out, but it's taking more energy than the body has to give. And this is where chronic disease becomes its prime focus, because chronic disease also implies a chronic long-term ongoing stress. And this long-term ongoing stress, repeating stress, is what eventually drains a patient out to a point where whatever strengths, whatever weaknesses that they've inherited become so drained of energy that pathology begins. So when we begin to make that paradigm shift in what it is that we're trying to achieve, I believe we move away from miasms into soul and survival and the survival instinct. What this means by comparison from soul and survival against classical homeopathy, or compared to classical homeopathy I should say, is that soul and survival is an evolutionary model. You see, based on the miasms, what is happening is that each generation is becoming worse, is becoming sicker, and is becoming more immoral as a result of that sickness. What soul and survival does, I think, is that it's in line with the Darwinian concept of adaptation and evolution, in the sense that nature passes on what works. And so, in fact, what is happening is that we are passing down what works against stress rather than what has failed against stress. See, if we look at an evolutionary model and we try and apply that to the miasms, then what is happening is that we should have become so progressively weak that fixing the miasms becomes irrelevant, because we're down so low, we should almost be extinct. But of course that hasn't happened. What nature does is that it works for the benefit of every one of its creatures, and that includes human beings. And so we have this evolutionary model where adaptation to stress and the remembrance of the strategies that were effective against that stress are then passed on to the next generation. Now, in most species, this will mean powerful muscles or venom or camouflage. But you see, in human beings, of course, we haven't developed down that line. Our greatest weapon is our brain. And so in order for the brain to function properly, what it does is that it's all based on memory. So if we can remember our major and most frequent stresses, then we can have in place a natural instinctive reaction to those frequent dangers and stresses. What soul and survival talks about is that those frequent dangers and stresses and our responses to them do not die at the grave with that individual. What happens in Hahnemannian style now, in true miasmatic style, is that we pass those on to the next generation. And so in fact what happens is that every generation that's born has in its unconscious an instinctive response and an instinctive memory of certain triggers and dangers. And this is why we find that our patients will become highly stressed to one thing, while other patients, that's not their problem at all. Some people will have and suffer greatly from a financial collapse, whereas other people, they will respond to that financial collapse, as we all will, but they will be able to rebound.